Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. We all have questions when it comes to brewing. Which hop should I use? What mashing schedule? How do I operate this piece of equipment? Does mash capping really matter for hot side oxygen protection? Where do you go for answers? I'm your host, Cade. Today in the lab, I'm speaking with one of the most prolific answerers of beer-related questions, Ashton Lewis. Yes, Mr. Wizard himself. I'm asking him what he's learned over the 30 years of answering questions in Brew Your Own Magazine. Now, if you're not familiar with Brew Your Own Magazine, it's a fantastic resource for homebrewers, and one of my favorite columns is written by Ashton. In each issue, he answers readers' questions through the Help Me, Mr. Wizard column, covering the entire gamut of beer and brewing. And he and I recently got to spend some time together on a trip to Belgium where we started talking about the things people ask, how some things have changed a lot and how other things have changed very little. And we thought, hey, this would be a great idea. Let's ask Mr. Wizard what he's learned over 30 years of answering questions. I hope you're ready. Ashton's a wealth of information, a true homebrew all-star. And did I mention he works for BSG Brewer Supply Group as technical support and training manager. He's faculty at the Siebel Institute, and he's the technical editor of BYO. So he knows his S about commercial brewing too. So I think you'll enjoy this one. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. Becoming a patron is easy. Once you've contributed at the $3 level or higher, you get access to the private Patreon Facebook page where all of the previous Q&A sessions are available to watch. So guests like Vinny Chilurzo, John Palmer, and the Brewlosopher himself, Marshall Schott. And I'd also venture a guess that we might schedule an upcoming Q&A where you could ask your questions of Mr. Wizard. The next guest, of course, is Andrew Burns of Dakota County Technical College. He's going to talk about getting a brewing education. Andrew, of course, worked as a brewer and as a brewery team manager before taking the job over at Dakota County Technical College. So he's got a perspective that you'll want to listen to if you're thinking about entering the brewing industry. All of this information and all of the information that you need to get access to this awesome resource is available at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. So go check it out. Thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. We're over 100 ratings on Apple Podcasts, which is awesome. And if you haven't yet left a rating or review on your podcast choice or podcast service of choice, I'd really appreciate it. Take a second, let us know what you think of the show, and also help others like you find us. Now, feedback this week is from listener Matt, who says, "Hey, Cade, I have a question that may be best posed to Drs. Philip Wheatstock and Brian Gibston, but you may have to serve as an interlocutor." And this is, of course, talking about the gas hopper system that I discussed with Philip and Brian a few episodes back. Matt says, "Looking at Philip and Brian's poster, the gas hopper is a closed system. I think this is a requirement, and if I recall correctly from the interview, this serves a few purposes: capture of the gas phase aromatic compounds rather than release, recirculation of CO2 and aromatic hop compounds, and in the system as pictured on the poster, the CO2 generated via fermentation recirculates between the fermenter and the water vessel via the temperature difference in the vessels. My question, could the system be adapted to a forced carbonation system? Would the water vessel still need to be in an elevation temperature at an elevated temperature? I understand that altering the temp could also alter the aromatics extracted in the gas phase. I've tried to adapt the diagram to show what I'm thinking. Are there drawbacks to this design? It seems easier adapted to homebrewing, and we don't have to worry about that darn Reinheitsgebot." So, hey, Matt, awesome question. I forwarded your question on to Philip and Brian, and here's the answer we got back. Philip responded and said, "Hi, Cade. This is a great idea from Matt. I'll keep my answer short." He asks, could the system be adapted to a forced carbonation system? In principle, yes. However, only very few hop volatiles will probably be transferred, as during forced carbonation, CO2 is bubbled through the beer only for a short time. We learned that we need to recirculate for 24 to 48 hours to transfer volatiles from hops to beer. Particularly, the more polar, oxygen-containing fractions are transferred rather slowly. But it should be easy to try it out and see what the outcome is. I would guess that a few aroma compounds will already be transferred. I'm guessing he means they're just during the forced carbonation process. The other question that Matt asks is, would the water vessel still need to be at an elevated temperature? And Philip says the higher temperature facilitates the volatilization of the aroma compounds, and some aroma compounds will have only limited concentration in the gas phase when the hot vessel remains at room temperature. Hence, yes, this is possible, but be aware that temperature does have an effect on the transfer efficiency and also on the composition of the gas that comes out. A fun way to play around with the system is to alter the temperature and monitor the aroma profiles of the resulting beers. He says, hope this answers the questions adequately. Regards, Philip. So cool. Yeah, Matt, thank you for asking that question about if it could be adapted to a forced carbonation system, and also about the temperatures that you need there. So it does sound like you're going to need a temperature differential, elevated temperatures in the hop water vessel. But yeah, it sounds like there are some ways to play around with CO2 and how that CO2 gradient is also applied, right? Because pushing things into the volatile phase in the hop water then allows it to transfer over to the cooler beer because it's colder over in that container, and also there's a lower concentration of those volatiles. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, awesome thoughts, Matt. And if you try this out, please let us know. I'd love to not only share your feedback on the episode, but also send it on to Philip and Brian as well. So thanks for sharing. All right, after this break, I'll be back talking with Ashton Lewis about the things he's learned over 30 years as Mr. Wizard. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. If you've read Brew Your Own Magazine, you'll be familiar with the Help Me Mr. Wizard column, where readers submit their brewing-related questions and Mr. Wizard answers. I recently got to spend some time with Mr. Wizard, also known as Ashton Lewis, and thought it would be fun to talk about what he's learned over 30 years of writing the Mr. Wizard column. So Ashton, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, firstly, I hope I'm not publicly outing you as Mr. Wizard. I think people know who you are and your affiliation with the Mr. Wizard column.
Yeah, that actually happened 20 years ago. So I was outed after 10 years of secrecy.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's funny because I've talked with John Palmer on the show, and I've talked with a couple of other people who really heavily influenced my brewing whenever I was a young brewer. And Help Me, Mr. Wizard was one of my absolute favorite. It still is one of my favorite columns to read because it's so cool. It's a blend of technical knowledge, it's practical advice, and it really covers everything. It covers technology questions, chemistry, sensory, and everything. And I guess my first question to you is, how do you possibly answer all of it?
Well, I answer all of it by having good questions to begin with. I think it's difficult to give good input without good questions. So I'm lucky to have questions that come in from our readers that are solid. But my background in brewing started when I was a home brewer in high school, and I grew up in Maryland. It was where I went to high school. And I remember when my best friend Tom Flores and I were home brewing, now we're both professionals in the industry, we had a real hard time finding any kind of information that related to us. And I was really intrigued as I began to learn more about brewing with the idea of kind of sharing back. So the way I answer questions is like researchers approach a problem, and that's kind of scouring the literature. I read quite a bit, but I also luckily have a good memory for beer and brewing, and I guess I'm lucky in that regard that I have a broad interest that I can draw from.
Yeah, for sure. And it is cool too. It's like one of the things I love about brewing is it scratches the itch, right? Like there's all kinds of stuff. There's technology questions, there's science question, there's artistic questions, like help me, Mr. Wizard, what hop should I put in my IPA? That's not an easy question to answer, right? Like that's something that's it's got all these different components in it, which I think is really, really cool. And of course, I want to ask you how you became Mr. Wizard, but first, of course, you're currently the technical support and training manager at BSG. You also have a faculty position at Siebel Institute of Technology, I believe. And of course, you're technical editor and Mr. Wizard with Brew Your Own Magazine. Is that all right?
That's all right. So everything you named is kind of a continuum of one career. It's just that my career touches a couple of different places.
Yeah. So how did you become Mr. Wizard?
Well, I'll try to give you the short story, but when I was a graduate student at University of California, Davis, in the early 90s, I was a student from 91 to 94, there was a gentleman that came into Davis who didn't know anything about brewing. His name was Carl Landau, and Carl had recently sold a magazine called Computer Language. And he decided to move his family to Davis because Davis is a nice community. He lived in the Bay Area. And he had this idea of starting a homebrew magazine, not knowing anything about homebrewing and not actually knowing that Davis at the time was the only university in the United States that had a brewing program.
Yeah.
So Carl learns this and he calls the brewing lab. And my friend Scott Ungerman answers the phone. Scott worked for AB for about 20 years and left as the brewmaster of Fairfield. And then Scott was the brewmaster for Anchor Brewing, actually through the acquisition, and stayed on for a little bit over a year after that. But anyhow, Scott answered the phone and Carl explains to Scott, he's going to open a homebrew magazine. He's looking for somebody to be involved. And Scott's like, well, that's probably not me, but you need to talk to Ashton Lewis. And that's literally how I got introduced to Brew Your Own. And then when Brew Your Own started in Davis, they had an office in downtown Davis, which was literally 3 blocks from my home. So my wife and I lived on 5th and East Street, and the Brew Your Own office was located 2nd and D Street. So I could just walk down and, be in the office.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. All as you're right there, studying. And is that what you got your degree in at Davis? Did you get it in the brewing program there?
Yeah, actually, I have a BS from Virginia Tech. And when I was a student at Tech, I knew I wanted to be a brewer. And Virginia Tech, now they have a brewing program, but at the time they did not. And I applied to graduate school in the Department of Food Science, and I was in Michael Lewis's laboratory as a graduate student. I also was in the very first Master Brewers program, which is through the University Extension program. So the first year of the Master Brewers program, there were 6 graduate students that were in that program. We were kind of given free admittance, if you will. And in exchange for being in the program, we were expected to help actually develop some of the curriculum and be kind of mentors in the program, really kind of help get it off the ground. So yeah, I was a student at Davis in the Department of Food Science.
Yeah, man, it's funny too because you keep saying all these names, right? Like Scott Ungerman and Carl Landau and Michael Lewis, and these are famous brewing names, right? These are people who also like you are famous and have careers in the industry. It's kind of amazing to see like all these people in this area at the same time, right? All these incredibly influential people in the brewing industry, all in this one location, all at the same time.
Well, yeah, in hindsight, at the time I was 21 years old when I started graduate school. So I was just a kid. And I remember like at Master Brewers meetings, Ken Grossman and Steve Dressler would come down and, Don Barkley from Mendocino Brewing Company and Grant Johnston from Marin Brewing Company. And these people that I felt like I was in the presence of rock stars and I was, but, Ken and Steve were young, that was like 11 years into Sierra Nevada, and Fritz Maytag would be at meetings, and it was crazy. And
there was also a young Tom Shellhammer at the time.
I was going to say,
right?
Tom Shellhammer was a little bit older than me, but yeah, Tom was getting his PhD when I was getting my master's, and it was a special time.
Yeah, that is, of course, how you and I met, through Tom. And as we were just here at the EBC, Tom and I and some of the other folks in the lab and some friends, Scott LaFontaine, were going around and touring some things. And you and I got to spend some time together touring Duvel with Scott Britton, which was an incredible experience.
I was blown away. The thing that impressed me about Duvel, there's so many different things that impressed me about Duvel, but the whole brewery that we saw was basically a new facility that had been slowly, bits of the brewery had been replaced and upgraded over time. And, we went into that brew house that had twin 500 hectoliter brew lines, and there was nothing of the original brew house. And then none of the old fermenters were there. They were all, new, modern, cylinder conical vessels. So yeah, that campus was incredible.
Yeah, there's also that scale too, right? Twin 500 hectoliter brew houses, right there, right? So, which was a lot of fun. But in any event, that was a great trip. And like I said, I got to spend some time with you, and we started talking. And I realized, hey, you know what? It would be really fun to ask Mr. Wizard what he's learned over. How long have you been doing the column, the Mr. Wizard column?
This will be my 30th year. So literally, our editorial calendar. We started out in April of 1995. It was the first year of Brew Your Own Magazine. So by the time we get through the end of this year, we'll be into that April of 2025 editorial calendar. So I don't have that many more months until I'm a 30-year veteran of that magazine.
That's amazing. Well, this is again an incredible time, right? You were there in Davis when the magazine was being created. You're around all of these amazing rock stars in the brewing industry. You become Mr. Wizard, and now you can look back over a 30-year career, of course, as part of Siebel, as part of BSG, as part of Mr. Wizard, BYO. You've got your foot in so many different pieces of the brewing industry. I thought, hey, let's ask Mr. Wizard what he's learned over 30 years. So you thought that would be a cool idea. And so here we are. So we'll spend this episode talking about what you've learned. And I guess I should ask, I know there's more than one thing, but what have you learned over the past 30 years, or where do you want to start?
Well, I'll tell you one of the things that I've learned that's been maybe really surprising, but I guess it shouldn't be that surprising, is that things today, the topics of interest today, are really not a whole lot different from the topics of interest when I got into this industry 30 years ago. What has changed, if I look back at, I'm kind of a gearhead, and I've worked in the stainless steel world for 20 years. But when I look at kind of the gear side of brewing, and when I talk about brewing, I'm thinking about raw materials through finished beer. I think the one area that's probably changed the most is wort boiling. The technology of wort boiling, and there's been a continual drive to have lower evaporation rates, lower energy input into wort boiling, less thermal input, for improved wort stability. But when it comes to mashing and lautering, fermentation, and those areas are pretty similar. So there's the wort boiling aspect that's changed a lot. The other thing that has changed dramatically, when I was a kid, when I was a young brewer, we were hammered into the head about the importance of beer stability, colloidal stability, clarity, and brewers spent all this time and energy on making clear beer. And the big breweries still do that. And now we have the opposite problem. The opposite problem is, how do we maintain what appears to be a colloidally unstable train wreck of a product and a really cool looking appearance without changing? And I think that is probably more difficult than taking a cloudy beer and making it clear and keeping it clear. So that's been a big change. And then the other just dramatic change, and this is really falling into your world and what Tom has done at Oregon State, is how we view hops. When I was a young brewer, my first brewing job was at Sudwerk in Davis, and Sudwerk still is a traditional German-style lager brewery. And at that time, a hoppy beer may have contained, maybe 3/4 pound of hops per barrel, maybe a pound of hops per barrel. And today we're talking, a pound of hops per barrel, and people look at you like, well, do you use any hops?
Exactly.
So that's changed. Yeah. And then also how hops are used. Where do they go in the process? again, when I was a brewer at Sudorp, all of our beers were hopped 3 times in the kettle. Early hop addition, mid boil, late boil, and then our pilsner we would put hops in the whirlpool. But there were really not that many beers that were dry hopped. Anchor Liberty in that Northern California area was of course dry hopped, and then the only Sierra Nevada beer that I'm aware of that was dry hopped when I was in California, or two of them, Celebration and Bigfoot. But they didn't, at the time, yes, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is a hoppy beer, but that style of beer was not dry hopped on a routine basis in the early 90s. So that's another huge change that's occurred. And then the other big change is this, I don't even know what to call it, but this fascination with putting like anything and everything in beer has been a recent occurrence.
Are you referring to the pastry stouts and the milk IPAs, lactose IPAs, and
yeah, that kind of stuff? Today pastry stouts are kind of like mild and kind of normal, but and even like the pastry IPAs and the milkshake IPAs are kind of normal, but things have gotten crazier where people are putting just like all kinds of stuff and Skittles and
donuts,
and candy and donuts and breakfast cereal. So yeah, back when I was a kid, brewers didn't do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's funny too. You said like 1 pound per barrel of hops, and yeah, I think some brewers would be like, "Oh, you must be making a lager," and it's like, yeah. But that's interesting. It is true. Like it seems like there has been a lot that's changed. Like we've started to focus more on hops. I mean, obviously the IPA has become much more popular since the 90s. But you mentioned like mashing and lautering and the whole like the whole brewing process just hasn't changed all that much. I mean, even over like 1,000 years, I mean, we're still kind of doing things the same way. We have better technology, right? But the process is still the same. There's still malt that's malted at a malt house, and then it gets shipped to the brewer who does a mash, and the mash is, either at rising temperatures or at a single infusion mash, which I think is most common. And then, it's a 60-minute mash or a 30-minute mash or a 20-minute mash. And those like numbers have been shown time and time again that there's nothing magical about 60 minutes. It's not like the mash is unconverted at 59 minutes and then over-converted at 61 minutes, right? I mean, it's just kind of a number that people were picked out of their heads, right? And decided to make this. But there's like, we have seen these changes, but like you mentioned, there are just, it seems like so many things that haven't changed, that are still the same.
Yeah, it is funny you mentioned that, because it's the variability with malt, it's consistent as we try to make malt. And I do work for BSG, but we recently changed our name. We're now RAR BSG. So RAR Malting owns BSG, and RAR is a 147-year-old malting company. We were found, no, I'm sorry, 100 and getting our years mixed up. 176-year-old malting company. We were founded in 1847. But it's interesting how the variability of malt is great enough that you would think that there needs to be some type of change at mashing to make consistent beer. And I really think that a lot of those times are just because it's an enzymatic reaction, and the rate of change slows down with time. It's just basically we mash more than we need to, where the variability of the raw material kind of disappears. But the one thing that I've thought about, we have different times and temperatures, and sometimes we do an isothermic mash, and then sometimes we try to mash where we heat, and then sometimes the mash inadvertently cools down. But one thing we don't do is change pH over the course of the mash. And I've kind of wondered, my head scratched it a couple of times. What would it be like to add acid or base during the mash to achieve different enzymatic activities because of pH?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I was recently with my head stuck in books about amylase activity in the mash. And so, yeah, I mean, those amylases have different pHs that they actually are active at. And it's interesting that beta amylase, right, is one of those enzymes that we really want to increase fermentability and, control your alcohol and stuff. It works like really nice at making maltose, which yeast really likes. But its temperature is lower than alpha amylase, and you still need need alpha amylase to break things off into chunks and like make things accessible for beta amylase and all this. And so it's sort of like flipped. The alpha amylase has a higher enzyme optimum and pH. Well, I think it's a higher, maybe actually it's a lower pH. I don't remember off the top of my head, but in any event, it has a different temperature and so different optimum conditions than beta amylase, but they're sort of flipped. So as we do this step mash, we sort of step up, from protein rest to beta amylase to alpha. And then by the time you're at alpha, you've denatured the protein and you've started the denaturization of the beta amylase. And so you're kind of fighting against yourself. So yeah, that's one of those things that I've always wondered, like, we're sort of in this balance against ourselves. Would pH change those things? If you change the pH in one way or direction, would it solve issues there? Yeah. That's an interesting.
I think it could. And I've always thought the same thing too. It almost seems like nature maybe designed the mash backwards, but the barley kernel really doesn't want to turn into malt. And it really, if we say that a plant wants to do something, the intent of that barley kernel is to turn into a barley plant. And we've just kind of harnessed those enzymes and done something else with it. But one could argue that the decoction mash inadvertently does take advantage of that proper sequence, because we do have alpha amylase activity and decoction mash that then gets to have the benefit of beta amylase. So there's that's kind of fun to think about.
Yeah, it is. It is fun to think about. But again, yeah, that's pretty cool to think that, like, all the things that have changed over 30 years, but then, so many things have still stayed the same, right? Like our mashing regimes and the way that we mash and, that sort of stuff. And again, the whole brewing process, right? It's malting and then mashing. Mashing uses mostly endogenous enzymes. There's some exogenous. We have the enzymes, right? We've isolated alpha and beta amylase, but a lot of brewers don't brew with them. They just use the malt enzymes still, there's all kinds of ways to optimize the brewing process, but brewers are so traditional that they've also sort of, stuck in those ways. But I think that was another thing that you and I were talking about too, is brewers are traditional, but they're also wildly creative too, and pretty clever people.
Yes. And that's, I've learned a lot from working with commercial brewers, and I've always thought commercial brewers are clever. And that's probably a little self-serving, because I consider myself a commercial brewer, even though I currently don't work in a brewery. So don't really want to consider yourself among unclever people. But I do have data to back it up. Like within Brew Your Own, we do track our readership, and we have reader surveys. And we know that our readers are, for the most part, college educated. A lot of them are graduate educated, and with a really diverse background in science and engineering. So, that's a fact. And then we see brewers doing, very creative things, not only today, but also historically. We look back at the history of brewing science, and we see Sorensen and Keldal and, all these great scientists that did things in brewing. Sorensen, Keldal, and I'm drawing a blank here on Hansen. They all worked for Carlsberg. And they changed not only the world of brewing, but really the world of food science with what they did.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'm always amazed with that. It's a series that I've been trying to find a guest to do, but I've always wanted to just do some profiles on scientists, right? Hansen, Pasteur, what was the guy that did students' T-test at Guinness?
Like
Guinness,
the statistical
test.
Drawing a blank on that too. But
I don't remember his name, but just like all that Keldal, right? All these people that were like drinking beer and making science happen. Fundamental scientific questions that still stand today, which I think is just super cool. But yeah, I think that's a cool one. Brewers are definitely clever people. I'm always amazed at how they're willing and able to innovate. One of the questions I had for you too is like, so you said you consider yourself a commercial brewer, but you of course write the Help Me Mr. Wizard magazine, which is part of Brew Your Own. That's for home brewers. How much overlap is there between the issues that home brewers are facing and the issues that commercial brewers are facing?
Well, I know today that the issues are quite common. And my history with home brewing, I started home brewing, but then I became a brewer, and I worked for a brewery, a small taproom brewery with limited distribution here in Springfield, Missouri for 23 years. So when I was writing Mr. Wizard for the longest time, people didn't know who I was. For 10 years. And then I kind of, got outed, if you will, with my name being part of my column. And I talked about commercial brewing a lot as a home brewer or a home brewing columnist. And I felt a little self-conscious doing that because I felt that what I thought I needed when I was a home brewer, I found in commercial brewing, but I hadn't been a home brewer since became a member of the industry. So in 2020, I got out of Springfield Brewing Company. I was a part owner, and I needed to devote all my time to BSG, and it just didn't seem like a good fit. So I got out of my ownership role, and the first thing I realized is when I was at Springfield Brewing Company, I had free access to do everything I wanted to do in the brewery, and I was like, oh no, what am I going to do now? So then I started homebrewing again. So now I feel legitimate that I'm homebrewing. But what I know now is that a lot of commercial brewers read my column. And what I hear from commercial brewers that still read my column is that they get a lot out of reading homebrewing magazines. And I know from the homebrewing audience that I interact with through Brew Your Own, the stories that I bring in and the information I bring in from commercial is applicable. And I think the reason that that's so true is that, it's a cliche, but we say beer is a blend of art and science. And the art side of beer does not care about scale. It doesn't matter if you're a home brewer doing 5 gallons, if you're a commercial brewer, producing let's say a 1 hectoliter test brew, or a Duvel producing 500 hectoliters at a time. The art side is the same. We're still about beer flavor. The technology on certain levels of small scale commercial brewing, like let's say a 15 barrel brew kettle, and I've done the math on this before, the surface to volume ratio of a 15 barrel kettle compared to a 5 gallon kettle is more similar than that 15 barrel kettle compared to a 500 barrel kettle. So the challenges that craft brewers have are really quite different than big brewers. And I think that's why home brewing and commercial brewing overlap so much.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really, I think I agree with that too. It's like, I mean, I'm still sort of fledgling in the brewing industry, right? I was a home brewer a lot longer than I was a commercial brewer or commercial. I wouldn't even call myself a commercial brewer before I was in the brewing industry, exposed to commercial, commercial brewing. But yeah, it is really interesting too, because there are some differences in scale and maybe some differences in equipment, but at the end of the day, it's like you said, that art doesn't care. They're still trying to make quality beer, right? Everyone wants to make a great beer, whether you're at home at 20 liters or whether you're a Duvel at, 500 hectoliter batches. It doesn't matter. Everybody wants to make your beer great.
Yeah. And so I've learned that the home brewer can learn from the big brewer about how to do things. The science of brewing, the process of brewing, and the big brewer can learn from the home brewer with the creativity. Because a lot of times, if you're working in a brewery, as much as home brewers romanticize the brewing process, in a big brewery, either you work in a department. When I say a big brewery, let's say 100,000 barrels and up. So for the listeners who might not know scale, 100,000 barrel brewery is. Well, Anchor Brewing Company was about 100,000 barrels. That's about their scale. Sierra Nevada and Chico is about 700,000 barrel capacity. Boulevard in Kansas City, Kansas is about a 250,000 barrel a year brewery. So 100,000 barrel a year brewery is not that big, but you're going to work in a department. You're going to work in wort production or cellar, finishing, packaging, the laboratory. You're working in a production facility. You're not necessarily, the art doesn't come out every day of the week. It certainly doesn't come out daily. It probably doesn't come out monthly for a lot of production brewers. And I think that's where the home brewer is an inspiration of the craft brewer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also something too is home brewers are more nimble than commercial brewers, or at least that's something I've seen. Like a home brewer, if you make a bad batch, again, it's 20 liters, it's no big deal. Well, it's not no big deal. You did spend time and effort to do it, and it feels terrible dumping a batch down the drain. But, it's a lot different when you've got, a 20 barrel batch or a 30 barrel batch that you're dumping down the drain. And you can't be as as free as saying like, okay, I want to do my mash at, I want to do a 30-minute mash, not a 60-minute mash. Cause I don't know, it's working and I make good beer and I have brand consistency and I may not want to take the time and effort to make a test batch that could go down the drain. But homebrewers can do it, and they can do experiments on it like we've done here at Brewlosophy. And and then they can, that's one of my favorite things about Brewlosophy, right, is that we do those experiments in a homebrew scale, but run it through a triangle test, run it through tasters and say, does this seem to make a difference? And I think that's just super cool. I think that's really something that commercial brewers can learn from too, is like, okay, look, the homebrewers did this at the homebrew scale, and it didn't make a big difference. It may make a big difference on our system. I don't know, but we can feel a little bit more comfortable in trying it, right? Or a little bit less like we're going to waste a whole batch if I actually try this.
Yeah, I mean, really what Brewlosophy has done is really, really cool. I mean, it's I really enjoy reading those experiments, and I think it's a great way to approach, really with beer, to borrow an expression from Michael Lewis, at the end of the day, it's all about flavor. And you can pick apart the analytical differences and say, well, if we did this, it's more efficient, or if we do that, it takes longer, or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's about beer flavor, or it might be another sensory, clarity or foam stability. But at the end of the day, that's what it's about. And that's what y'all are measuring at Brewlosophy, is can you taste the difference? And that's a really big start to testing a process. But to kind of drift back to something related to this, what's changed in 30 years is how brewers perceive different styles. And I like to say never. And there was a little brewery down in San Diego that was making fun of fizzy yellow beer for a while. And I believe that brewery might make some pale colored lagers these days. So never say never is a really important story to remember. But another thing that's changed is how we view adjunct. When I was a young brewer, the A word was a dirty word. Brewers who use adjuncts were deemed less than crafty, and adjuncts were not seen as anything other than a quote filler or a quote cheap ingredient. And the truth is that adjuncts are not cheap. The adjuncts we use in the United States, corn and rice, are very expensive food crops. They're not cheap ingredients. But with regard to what you were just talking about with Brewlosophy, one of the things that big breweries can do that small breweries can't is run so-called specials in the brewery. So if you're, let's say, an Anheuser-Busch, and you slip in a special Budweiser that has an experiment, Budweiser's blended, and is blended a lot, and they blend for consistency. So a big brewery can make a test beer disappear, where a craft brewery can't, because most craft breweries are not blending, and they're certainly not blending to the point where if something was radically different, you literally can't make it disappear. So the risk of failure is just too great.
Totally. That's a really good point too. Like the economies of scale there is really interesting. Yeah, burying something like some of my research is going to be focusing on smoky hops as I get into my PhD, and so that's a potential opportunity, and especially big brewers, that might be much easier if you have a lot of smoky hops. Just bury it in some in a beer that's got other hop flavors. You might be able to blend lots together, right, or do those kinds of things. Those are really cool, and those are sort of some different scales in terms of home brewers and commercial brewers. But you mentioned something earlier too about beer being like the Michael Lewis comment about beer being about flavor, and then you also mentioned art or science. And this was a recent podcast, not really recent, I guess it was probably 6 or 7 months ago at this point, but that Marshall and I did on the Brewlosophy podcast, and we asked ourselves the question: is brewing an art or a science? So I want to ask you that before we take a break.
Well, from my perspective, it's first and foremost science.
Okay.
And the reason I say that and feel so convinced by it is that brewing left small scale production a very long time ago, and it's been a commercialized operation for hundreds of years. And the only way for that to have occurred was with the implementation of scientific principles. Even before brewers had thermometers or hydrometers, brewers were doing things to produce consistent beer with raw materials that may have been less than ideal. So I really think that kind of the science and engineering came first to allow brewing to get big. I think the art was always there, but I think that the art came after the solidification of the process and the engineering. That's my opinion.
I like it. I think Marshall said something similar, if I remember correctly, from the podcast, where it was sort of like they're both sort of intertwined. Like you can be artistic using tools, right?
Yes.
A painter uses certain types of paints or like nice brushes or, different sorts of, brush, textures, right? They use all of these different tools. And as the tools get better, the art sometimes gets better, and so, yeah, that's a great way to think about it, right? Is that art is still there, but the science impacts it and makes it better.
Yeah, I think if Bach hadn't really perfected the way pianos and organs were tuned, it would have been very, very difficult to have musical compositions of the complexity that they are with an in-tune instrument. So I think that the science of that musicianship had to come before the composition of the great art.
Yeah, you're right. Dun 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 dun. Exactly like that, right? And on that, with me singing, let's take that into a break, and we'll come back talking about things that still interest Mr. Wizard after 30 years. We'll be right back. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Call me a sci-fi or fantasy nerd, but I believe in magic. There's so much more that we don't understand and so many questions that we have. Anyone that can help us answer those questions often seems like a wizard. And Ashton, after 30 years of answering people's questions, how do you still keep the magic alive?
My magic kind of goes up and down. Got to be honest here. Sometimes I kind of feel like I'm losing my fire, my spirit sometimes. And a lot of my excitement comes from going to meetings, going to Master Brewers meetings, Craft Brewing Conference, going to the Great American Beer Festival, getting out and be around beer, talking to home brewers. So that's the way I keep my juices flowing. You mentioned earlier we were together at the EBC over in France recently, and going to those kind of meetings really kind of keeps my interest in beer and brewing alive.
Yeah. And it's fun too, like the homebrewers, the enthusiasm that homebrewers have. I find a lot of commercial brewers talk about that. They seem sort of jaded about, what it is, the commercial production of beer. And then they spend an afternoon with a homebrewer and they're like, yeah, this is right. This is why I got into this in the first place. And so that was sort of a question then. So after 30 years of answering people's questions and providing advice and stuff, are there things that still interest you? Are there things that you still think about like, I wonder why this is?
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned earlier that doing like a pH profile, I think is an interesting concept. The other thing is keeping raw materials available and available to the commercial brewer is a challenge right now. And it's not a challenge that we're actually seeing, but it's a challenge we're thinking about. So right now, I think a lot of the things that I do at BSG I answer questions from our sales staff and our customers, and some of those questions are hypothetical. It's like, well, what if this happens? Or even thinking about that as a way of kind of getting new conversations flowing. I like to talk to brewers about thinking about what could happen tomorrow. And one example of that is the dependence of infusion mashing. And I've mentioned this many times at meetings. If I were to build a brewery today, even though with today's raw materials you can make great beer with isothermal mashing, there's no way that I would build a brewery without a mash mixer in the lauter tun. And the reason I say that is that one of the consequences of high temperature and low low rainfall for barley is the potential for changes in gelatinization temperature. And if the gelatinization temperature moves up too high, right now we've seen variability with gelatinization temperatures that are manageable. But when gelatinization temperature goes up, the things we were discussing earlier about alpha amylase and beta amylase become challenging because those enzymes rely on starch that's in solution to be, useful to the brewer. So there are a lot of things that I think about related to that. The other is the whole push to be green and reducing our consumption of everything surrounding beer. So I think in today's environment, if we simply challenge ourselves to make the same beer that we made yesterday with either a change in raw material or a different approach to energy or water consumption, we've just changed things. We're trying to do the same thing with a different set of variables. And I think that intellectually is very, very interesting.
Yeah, those are really cool. Scott LaFontaine and I, and Bernardo, his graduate student, talked about this whenever we talked about rice malt a couple of months ago. As barley is changing, like you said, with these issues related to climate change. Barley's changing, but rice is actually predicted to stay relatively stable, which was, of course, a cool thing for Scott because he's researching rice malt. But that's potentially a challenge for brewers, as barley continues to change. And it's not just that the quality of the ingredient changes. Like you said, the process might need to change too. We have this isothermal single infusion mash, but maybe we should be doing something like a decoction or adding exogenous enzymes or changing, some temperature profiles. And then, if you're denaturing enzymes, maybe adding some back before you go into the boil or changing the pH. I mean, this is all really, really cool stuff. The other things that I see too are people. It felt like 10 years ago, especially, it was especially for home brewers. It was like find the best equipment, right? Find the all-in-one system, or find the, you need to brew on a Brew Easy or something, or you need to stop your fly sparging and you need to start brewing a bag and you need to have this or that pump or this immersion chiller. And there's, I like that kind of stuff. That stuff's fun because it's like optimization. But there's also this question of like, do you really need all that equipment, or is it really worth it? Is it actually doing something for your beer?
Well, I think you might have more data about this than I do because of Brewosophy, but as a former professional gearhead, when I worked at Mueller, that's what we did. We, designed new equipment, and it wasn't just for beer; it was all different types of industries. But I love technology and I love innovation with equipment. But I know from my own experience, going from commercial brewing with a lot of flexibility with what I could do in the brew house and also in the cellar, to home brewing. I know that I can produce really good homebrew with very simple equipment. So I fall into the camp, and it's not just because I work for a raw material supplier, but I've always thought that raw material is the key. If you start out with crappy raw material, it's really, really difficult to make good beer from, less than great raw material. I don't think technology necessarily changes the quality of beer. I think the technology makes it easier. And I think that easier is really, really important for commercial brewing. But to be quite honest, at home, what might be easier in a commercial brewery, like a 3-vessel brew house with pumps and valves and instrumentation and all this kind of stuff, I think it's a bigger pain in the ass at home because it's like more stuff to clean. It's more stuff to like keep on top of. You got to store it. You got to know how to use it. And at the end of the day, I think it actually makes the brewing process more difficult. And I think the ROI, if you will, is not apparent in the finished beer. And I think that a lot of the things I read from Brewlosophy, y'all have done different beers with different process modifications. And to be candid on some of the things that I've read, I'm like, well, that has to make a difference. And then go read the results. It's like, nope. No significant difference on the triangles.
Right.
And I think that's the cool thing about brewing is that, yes, the process, the equipment, the technology, it affects the bottom line of a commercial brewery, which is very important to a business, but it doesn't always have an effect on flavor.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because there is this like emulation, right? That homebrewers are constantly trying to emulate, commercial brewers. But then one thing that's not talked about a lot too is commercial brewers trying to emulate homebrewers as well too, right? I mean, they need process controls and they need that sort of stuff, but homebrewers also, like you said, get to be creative and they get to come up with fun new ideas and fun new ways to do things, which I think is really cool. And like you said, I think even commercial brewers would love to brew on simpler equipment. I mean, we went to Brasserie de la Seine in Brussels while we were there. And one of the head brewer there's big things was, their system, he's able to control every part of his system manually. Right. And so he has some automation, but it's oh gosh, I can't remember the size of the brew house, but I want to say it was at least a 25 or 30 barrel brew house. And he's controlling most of those processes manually, which to a commercial brewer, they're kind of going like, oh crap, I can't just like push a button and, move things around. Like that's a lot of extra work. But he was saying he wanted to be more like home brewers so that he had control over every aspect and so that he could pay attention to different parts and pieces of it and the parts and pieces that he felt like were important to his beer, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I remember one time I went to a brewery, and I don't do this very often, but I'll call them out by name. But it's New Oberpfalz, which is kind of a made up name. There is no Oberpfalz, and there's no New Oberpfalz. But anyhow, they're New Oberpfalz Brewery, and they're in Indiana, but they're in Chicagoland. So they're just over the border, and they do traditional German lagers. So I'm in there, and I can't remember the owner, brewmaster's name, but I was hanging out in the brew house and we're having a conversation, and there was something missing from my experience in brew houses. And when I realized what it was, I said, oh my God, it's really quiet in here. And their brew house was primarily gravity. And he was collecting word and doing this stuff without all this noise of pumps and, air valves opening and the drum of a pump, that wasn't in the background, and it was a very relaxing atmosphere, which is different than most breweries. So the automation is definitely something that the home brewer looks to the commercial brewer and they want to geek out on the automation, but a lot of times the commercial brewer does feel like they've kind of lost the feel of what it is to make beer.
Yeah, lost the control, right? A lot of commercial brewers talk all the time. They say that, all I do now is push buttons. That's kind of the joke, the fight between cellar folks and brewers, right? The cellar people like to say that they're the ones that are, handling the beer and managing oxygen and all the temperature control, and the brewers just push buttons. But which is kind of fun.
It's largely true.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, and that's kind of a nice thing too, right? Even all these all-in-one systems like the Grainfather or whatever, it is kind of nice to be able to just put the ingredients in there, push a button, and then let it go, right? And then all you have to do is come and clean it, or you just got to lift a grain bag out or something like that. That's really nice and convenient. But there is something fun about doing the hands-on brewing and having that control over the process.
Yeah, I actually use a Grainfather. I don't use the push the button thing. The only thing I use on the Grainfather that's automated is kind of the temperature control mechanism.
Yeah.
But I've kind of changed my process to be more like what I would consider a normal brewhouse operation. But everybody's different, and I do like the hands-on. And I remember I was talking to Mitch Steele years ago. Mitch was still at Anheuser-Busch in Merrimack, New Hampshire, and we were sharing a beer together in San Diego at a CBC. And I knew that Mitch still homebrewed. So I was asking him, I'm like, what's it like to homebrew when you're at work? I think Merrimack has like an 800 barrel brew house.
Yeah.
What's it like to homebrew? And he's like, when I homebrew, and I don't know if this is still true, but he's like, I don't do anything like I do at work. He said, I don't measure anything. I don't weigh out the malt. I just go on feel, screw it. I just want to make beer, but I don't give a crap about all the stuff that I worry about at work because that's work. And it was a really refreshing take on what it's like for a commercial brewer to homebrew.
Yeah, exactly. It's stress free, right? It's all the stress free and short and shoddy. That's like the Brewlosophy short and shoddy series, right? It's like, hey, what if I just like take a handful of salts? I just sprinkle some salts in there and take some malt. Like, yeah, this feels right. I put this in the bag. This is right. And then you brew with it and you make a beer. And does it taste the same? And there's been so many times where not taste the same, but does it still taste good? We haven't ever done I don't think we've done. Maybe we have done a triangle test of short and shotties, but certainly we've served people these beers and said, okay, this is a pale ale. How does it taste? And it'd be a pale ale with like no salt measurement. The grains were probably measured, but like a 30-minute mash, a 30-minute boil, no whirlpool, maybe some chilling, maybe not, depends on the day, all these kinds of things. It's just like throwing things out the window, which is super cool. But that actually, so that is a good question for you as well. Since over your 30-year career, there still seem some things that you go like, WTF? What's going on here? Like, why are people still doing this? What are some are there things that you're like, why do people still do this? I don't understand. After 30 years,
there are, and one of the things is like the WTF. And I don't mean to do this. I never like to ask a question that could be perceived as like a smart ass question or something. But I've been to enough breweries of a certain size, because I'm a gearhead and I work for a maltster. So the question I often ask is like, I see a brewery with like a 4-roll mill or a 6-roll mill, and I'm genuinely curious how often brewers are doing grist evaluations. And I remember, 2 years ago, I was at a brewery, 100,000 barrel per year brewery, 6-roll mill. And I was just kind of curious, how often do you do sieve test? And it was like, these two guys started looking at each other and I'm like, uh-oh. I just ask a bad question. Like, well, I hate to say it, but we haven't like done that in a year. And I'm like, I can't roll my eyes, but I'm thinking, holy cow, you haven't checked your grist in a year? That's one of the things that blows me away. It's like, especially, I don't care if you're a home brewer or a big brewer, people talk about extract yield. I miss my extract or my yield sucks or whatever. And it's like, have you checked your mill? And the answer to that question is usually no.
Yeah, exactly. We get that question a lot on our Q&A sessions for the Brewlosophy podcast. And it's always like, hey, I missed my efficiency number. I didn't hit this or I didn't hit that. And it's like, okay, have you checked your mill? Or like, oh, I'm low on this. I I put in the grains, I put in the mash, I did the mash temperatures and all this stuff. And it's like, I was milled at the homebrew store. Well, okay, that's gonna, I mean, that's not to say that you can't do that. It's just not going to be as consistent. You're going to have some differences there. And the homebrew store is certainly not doing sieve tests, checking their grist mill. They're just, setting it at wherever the Sharpie is that they, they set on the dial, right? Like, here's the Sharpie for this type of malt and here's the Sharpie for this type of malt.
Yeah, they don't know your system. So
yeah,
there are pros and cons of having your own mill. I have my own mill at home, and I've realized that some of these mills are not very durable, and the rollers get dull pretty quickly and they don't work very well. But that's one of those questions. The older I get, and one thing that I have seen change a lot is yeast. So when I was in the early 90s, dried yeast was horrible. I mean, we knew it was bad because at Davis, we used to, in the brewing lab, and Davis in the undergraduate program, there's not a lot of brewing classes, but there's basically a year-long program. There's 3 different classes. And in the brewing lab, we would, make beer. That's where we would do all the ASBC analyses we didn't know all of it, but we went through a lot of the ASBC analyses and actually did those by hand, along with brewing microbiology. So back then, it was pretty easy to buy dried yeast that had contaminants. So we'd streak out these dried yeast, and they had wild yeast and bacteria, and there's just kind of like a hodgepodge of like stuff that you don't want in your beer. Well, today dried yeast supply has gotten really good, and there are many companies in the world that are producing really high quality dried yeast. But that's one of the things that, to me, I sometimes wonder, for smaller breweries to really spend too much time playing yeast propagator when there's other things that they could be focusing their time on. And then the other thing that kind of surprises me, I hate to admit it, I spent a fair amount of time looking at Facebook stuff and some of these homebrew groups, and homebrewers will post pictures and they'll ask the question, is this infected? And it's based upon a picture, or they'll pour a New England style IPA and the question is this oxidized? And usually, is this oxidized is followed by a picture of a beer that has kind of a tannish brown color. And, that one you like to say, yeah, it could be oxidized, but I don't know, stick your nose in it. You tell me, is it oxidized?
Exactly.
Or,
you need to know. Yeah.
Is this infected? I don't know. Does it taste like crap? Does it smell funky? So I think a lot of times these questions, and it's not just homebrew questions, but it's commercial brewing questions. I think that the WTF sometimes is, are people, especially with the automation, are brewers too hands off? Do they not stick their tongues in things and their noses in things? I believe not at home oversampling, but in a commercial fermenter with a swickle, pull samples during fermentation, smell it and taste it. And there's a lot of brewers that I talk to that they don't do in process, just routine. And I'm not talking about a big brewery with a sensory panel. I'm talking about a one-person brewery or two-person brewery that they're not pulling fermentation samples and smelling the tasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually really cool that the brewery I worked at in Austin, Blue Owl, as part of the tour that you got for the brewery, you walked back in amongst the fermentation tanks and you got to sample off the Zwickle. And it was really cool to see, like, okay, here's this beer, here's our core beer or whatever. In this case, like Little Boss, which is an American, it was a sour brewery, so like a sour American wheat. And so you say, okay, here's Little Boss on day 1, and then you taste that of the Zwickle, and okay, here's Little Boss on day 7 or so, which was about the time that it was done fermenting. All right, this is what it tastes like. Here's Little Boss in the bright tank, and then here's Little Boss on tap, at the brewery. And it's like, it's really cool for people to see, like, oh, wow, beer really makes a change as it goes from, this fermentation over to the end. That was super cool. And I think it would be really fun for brewers to put more of that stuff on the tour. And you don't even have to be technical about it, right? You can just say, here's what a fermenting beer tastes like. It tastes like apple and, raw pumpkin and all these, flavors. And you can taste yeast and sometimes sulfur and all this other stuff that's going on. It doesn't taste like beer. It tastes totally different. Right. And I just think that's kind of fun for people.
I agree. And I think that's one reason why many practical brewers don't taste beer during the process, because young beer doesn't taste great, but it doesn't taste bad. And to me, that's the key. If you've got, let's say you have a wort spoiler, you're going to pick up a wort spoiler within 24 to 48 hours of fermentation. So if you have an off flavor early on, it ain't getting better. It's going to be there. So if you're going to dump a beer, you better do it, sooner than later.
Yeah.
And so I think that for all brewers, I think, detecting problems as early as possible, or if you detect a problem and there is a solution to the problem, how do you rescue a beer? What's your rescue solution and how do you implement it? Because there's some solutions that are enzymatic. Let's say you're making a cider and you want to filter the cider, and you discover that you've got pectin in the cider, but you haven't added pectinates. Well, don't add pectinates when it's 0 degrees Celsius, because it's not going to be active. So you better know you've got a pectin problem when your cider's warm, so you can actually do something about it.
Huh. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Like knowing the science behind it, so you can actually solve it. And it is interesting too. There's so much to know about the ingredients, and you mentioned how important ingredients are. But that's a great example too of like one of those things that was an impetus for this show is understanding the ingredient itself, right? So like understanding, okay, if I add pectinase at 0 degrees Celsius and the cider doesn't get clearer, right? well, that's because you added it at 0 degrees Celsius, not because there's any problem with, your brewing processes or anything like that. And so that's one of those things that I think is really interesting, is like how little people know about the ingredients that they're brewing with. You see a recipe online and it says put 2-row. That's one of my favorites. Put 2-row in, the whatever, 10 pounds of 2-row. Well, all barley, well, not all barley, but most barley is 2-row, right? At least most that we have available today. Put 8 pounds of 2-row in a 5-gallon, in whatever, 5 gallons of water, mash it and all that, and then you'll have this beer that's supposed to be 1010 or 1040 OG and 1010 finishing gravity, and ferment it with Chico yeast or this yeast. And it's like, yeah, that just totally ignores all of the process variables. And also, you didn't really understand too that 2-row is barley, right? I just think that's one of those things that's funny to me. Every time
2-row drives me crazy, because it's like, yeah, you mentioned it earlier. Most barley is 2-row. Now in the United States, we do still grow 6-row, but not a lot. But it's like somehow 2-row has become like a shorthand for, I think it means pale malted barley. But is it Pilsner malt? Is it a light pale? Is it pale ale malt? Is it Maris Otter? Is it Golden Promise? Is it European 2-row? I mean, what the hell is 2-row? And then, yeah, these blanket recipes, add 4 pounds of 2-row, mash at 160 Fahrenheit for 45 minutes, and you're going to have all these. And then brewers say, well, my final gravity is supposed to be 1010, and it's stuck at 1012. It's like, well, is it stuck, or is it actually just 1012?
Yes, it's just done, right? Exactly. Is it just done?
Yeah, it's been at 1012 for the last 3 weeks. It's stuck. What do I do?
Yeah.
It probably isn't stuck.
It's probably finished. Yeah. And that's another thing too that I think is really fun, and something that I've really enjoyed with Brewlosophy is like those differences, those small differences, right? I don't think we have occasionally done analyses like, okay, if an experiment, their finishing gravity was 1010 and 1012, right? Did they actually taste different, right? I know we've had experiments where that's been the case and there was no significant difference between the experiment. And then there were some others where it was significant, right? But not probably because of the gravity, but because of whatever factor was at play. But those kinds of questions are always something that's really interesting to me. And I'm sure you get those questions all the time, right? Like somebody says, help me, Mr. Wizard, my beer's stuck at 1012. It's supposed to be 1010. What do I do? And how do you go about answering that kind of stuff?
I make a lot of assumptions, and oftentimes I'll state my assumptions. It's like a math examination where you have to state your, put your variables in there or whatever your assumptions are. Because a lot of times it's, I feel like I'm Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers on Car Talk. Somebody asks a question, it's like I misinterpret the question. But so I'll try to sometimes redefine the question and say, well, based upon what I think is happening, this is what could be the problem. So a lot of it's kind of fantasy land, where somebody says, well, I'm going to name a beer. I already mentioned Budweiser, so I'll mention Budweiser again. So if somebody tastes a Budweiser and says Budweiser is watery and it's highly carbonated, it's like, well, number one, it's not watering, because if you degas Budweiser and drop a hydrometer in it, it actually has more residual extract than a lot of ales with the same original gravity. And then the notion that a light colored American style lager is overcarbonated, it's like, no, it's not. It's got the same amount of CO2 or sometimes less than craft ales. So then it's like, well, what do you really mean by quote watery? Do you mean that it has a light flavor profile? Do you mean that it finishes clean? Does overcarbonated mean that it seems to have a high level of carbonation? That could be, maybe it's due to the beer pH and how carbonation expresses with different pHs. So a lot of times I'll answer questions and I'll basically state my assumptions and say, well, based upon this way I'm reading the question, here's what the answer could be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thinking about it then that way. Here's what I assume. And we do that too whenever we answer questions from Brewlosophy. Like sometimes the questions are clear enough that you can answer, but when those situations, especially when people are asking about gear or technical questions about like, okay, I'm trying to improve cold side oxidation, and here's my process, but I'm still getting oxidized beers. That stuff's kind of hard. It's like, well, okay, this is our assumptions based on what you've told us. These are some potential problems, and then here's where you might go down this path. And that again is one of the reasons why I love the Help Me Mr. Wizard column. Before we wrap things up, and remember, I always asked at the end of the show, what's one thing that you want people to take away from this? But I'm not going to ask that yet. I'm just getting you primed for it. What I want to ask first is, what advice does Mr. Wizard have for brewers after 30 years?
The one piece of advice that I would offer any brewer is to approach whatever you're doing with the idea that you're gonna solve your problem with the simplest way possible. And when I say solve the problem, I mean go about producing beer. Use the simplest process you possibly can, and only add complexity to your process when you have to. That's my number one piece of advice, and that includes not only the process, the engineering, but also ingredients. If you can brew a great beer with one malt, one hop, yeast strain, minimal changes to your water chemistry, that's great. If you're lacking a flavor that you can't get from that single malt, then add another malt. But these kitchen sink recipes that I read, nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with it. But the problem with kitchen sink solutions is that if you want to change something, it's really difficult to know what knob to turn.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really true. I see that a lot as well. It's fun too, because I've started originally, whenever I was first a homebrewer, I think I even mentioned this a little bit earlier, I used to think about recipes in terms of the pounds of malt, right, that you're supposed to put into a beer. But the pounds of malts are totally irrelevant, not irrelevant, but they're totally dependent on your situation, your system, your mill, for example, the ingredients, right, that you got, right, the different features of all that stuff. And so me putting 10 pounds of malt in my system and you putting 10 pounds of malt in your system is very likely going to result in a very different beer, even if even if we're using the same ingredients, or if we're not using the same ingredients, you're buying at your local homebrew store. And so commercial brewers, I've always seen, they talk about recipes in terms of percent, and then they give you some statistics, right, to hit some gravity numbers or whatever, mash profiles and water profiles and that kind of stuff. But even then, I think is it Vinny Chilurzo that said like he's happy to give away the recipe for Pliny the Elder because nobody can brew it on the same as his system, right? Because it's just unique. Every system is unique. So I wonder, does that make sense to you? You think the same thing or think a little different?
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, it's like, I used to be a halfway decent sax player, but I mean, halfway decent means I, kind of suck. But yeah, you can read a Charlie Parker, transcribed solo, but I mean, you can play it note for note. It's not going to sound like Charlie Parker. You don't have his tone, his embouchure. You don't have the whatever that guy had that made his sound what it was. You don't have it. Nobody has it. So the notes on a piece of paper are just part of the recipe, and the recipe on a piece of paper is just part of what goes into making beer.
Mm-hmm. But it's so much fun, right? Because that's the thing. You can try to emulate that recipe and then try to, figure out how to make it on your system and iterate and try different technologies and different ingredients and dive into all that stuff. And that's why people like you and me have jobs, right?
Exactly.
So I love it. All right. Well, Ashton, it is that time of the show now. I'm going to ask you all the things that we talked about. If there is one thing that you want brewers to take away from today's episode, what would it be?
Well, the one thing I would want brewers to take away is never stop innovating, even if the innovation is with that same beer that you love. If you've got a house blonde ale and that's what you like to brew, don't stop innovating, because you can produce the same beer day in and day out and still innovate with your process. You can innovate with changing your flavors. You can innovate by making beers that drive your personal palate's interest, but never stop innovating, never stop asking questions, never stop learning. And that'll make you, if you're a hobbyist, that'll keep the hobby interesting and vital. And if you're a commercial brewery, it's imperative that you don't stop innovating and don't stop asking questions.
Yeah, never stop asking questions. I love it. And of course, if you have those questions, you can write in to Mr. Wizard, right, to BYO, and maybe your questions will be published in an upcoming episode, or an upcoming article or issue. There we go, of the magazine. Come on, I got there eventually, but
you got there. Yeah, byo.com. You can write into mail at byo.com. Yes, please, if you're interested in appearing in our magazine, we actually do take those questions to heart, and I love seeing questions from brewers.
Yeah. So send those questions on if you've got questions of Mr. Wizard. Ashton, this has been a lot of fun. I feel like this is something where we're going to have to bring you back in another few years, right? And after 35 years, and then after 40 years, and see if anything's changed, between these. But thank you again so much for your contribution to home brewing and brewing in general. But also for the column Help Me, Mr. Wizard. It was super influential in my brewing career, and I'm sure tons of the listeners that are listening here have also enjoyed it. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Well, thank you. It was great spending time with you in Belgium, and look forward to seeing you in Minneapolis here at the World Brewing Congress. So
yeah, I'm excited too. So we'll see you there. All right. Well, next week, Jordan and I will be back talking about Mr. Wizard's magic, and we'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.